Thousands of enemy troops surrounded Khe Sanh. Inside the isolated base, American soldiers prepared for battle, while many feared nobody would survive. Heavy fog covered the hills surrounding Khe Sanh, as both sides quietly prepared for one of the war's most brutal confrontations. American Marines strengthened bunkers, checked ammunition, and waited nervously while intelligence reports warned of growing enemy activity nearby. Several miles away, North Vietnamese soldiers moved through jungle trails carrying supplies and preparing positions around the American base. A Vietnamese farming family heard distant artillery and worried the fighting was moving dangerously closer to their village. Inside Khe Sanh, helicopters delivered supplies while Marines watched surrounding hills for signs of approaching enemy forces. North Vietnamese commanders studied maps carefully, discussing ways to isolate and pressure the heavily defended American stronghold. Villagers quietly gathered belongings, fearing they might soon need to leave their homes to escape the fighting. An American sentry spotted suspicious movement on a distant hillside and immediately reported it to headquarters. As darkness fell, both sides waited silently, knowing the coming days would change countless lives forever. Without warning, enemy artillery exploded across Khe Sanh, shaking bunkers and sending Marines rushing for cover. Shells continued falling throughout the base while communication teams struggled to coordinate defensive positions under heavy bombardment. North Vietnamese artillery crews fired continuously, attempting to weaken defenses before larger attacks could begin. In a nearby village, frightened families hid inside shelters as explosions echoed across the countryside. American Marines emerged from bunkers to assess damage and discovered several positions had been heavily impacted. Military doctors treated wounded soldiers while artillery fire continued striking different areas of the base. Enemy forces gradually tightened their positions around Khe Sanh, increasing pressure on the isolated defenders. A Vietnamese father told his children to stay calm, though fear was visible across his exhausted face. American commanders realized the siege had truly begun and that relief might not arrive quickly. As another barrage struck the base, Marines prepared themselves for what could become a very long battle. Days passed under constant bombardment while American soldiers endured exhaustion, stress, and the ever-present threat of attack. Helicopter pilots risked their lives daily, flying through enemy fire to deliver desperately needed supplies. North Vietnamese troops dug trenches closer to American positions, preparing for future assaults against the base. Villages watched military aircraft cross the sky and wondered how much longer the fighting would continue. Food, ammunition, and medical supplies became increasingly important as the siege dragged on without signs of ending. A young Marine wrote a letter home, unsure whether he would ever see his family again. North Vietnamese commanders remained determined, believing pressure would eventually force the Americans to abandon Khe Sanh. Nearby civilians continued struggling through daily life while surrounded by the dangers of war. Another major artillery attack struck the base, causing additional casualties and testing American resolve. Despite mounting pressure, Marines continued defending every position and refused to surrender the battlefield. Powerful American airstrikes targeted enemy positions surrounding Khe Sanh, dramatically increasing the intensity of combat. Explosions lit the hills as aircraft repeatedly attacked suspected enemy supply routes and troop concentrations. North Vietnamese soldiers endured heavy bombardment while continuing efforts to maintain pressure on the defenders. A Vietnamese family watched distant flashes on surrounding hills and prayed for the violence to end. Inside Khe Sanh, exhausted Marines realized they had survived far longer than many had expected. Reinforcement plans moved forward while enemy attacks gradually became less effective against determined defenders. Months of fighting had transformed the battlefield into a devastated landscape, marked by destruction and sacrifice. American forces finally began breaking the isolation surrounding Khe Sanh and reopening critical supply routes. The siege slowly came to an end as surviving soldiers looked back on everything they had endured. Khe Sanh remained standing. For soldiers and civilians alike, the battle became a lasting reminder of war's terrible cost.